Thank you for joining us for this episode. Today, we're joined by Dr. Richard Maharaj, and we're going to be speaking about dry eye misinformation on social media on the OI Show. Well, thank you again for joining us. We're excited to have Dr. Richard Maharaj on, and he is practicing in Toronto. It is awesome to have you on the show. Good to see you, my man.
Thank you very much. Good to be here. Appreciate the opportunity to chat.
I think we've known of each other for a really long time, but you were generous in inviting me to a dry eye meeting, and I'm very honored to have gotten to speak at your meeting. And coming up, we've got another meeting that you've invited me to. Tell everybody a little bit about yourself and your practice. And then, hey, I think we should plug this dry eye meeting that's coming up. And if you're listening to this after 2022, just know that it usually comes around at the end of the year. And so you'll want to go to it in the future.
For sure. Well, thanks, David. Appreciate it. Yeah. So I practice at the Prism Eye Institute that's just outside of Toronto. And we are a surgical medical facility, both ophthalmology and optometry. I run the dry eye and ocular surface division there. And so this is sort of a recent venture. My previous life was at 𝐊𝐧𝐨𝐰. So we ran actually a dry eye specific referral center for the last decade. And we were the first in Canada as a referral center for ocular surface disease that was optometric centered. So been doing it for a while, seen a lot of dry eye, and I've seen everything kind of come and go. Part of my other work obviously involves education. You mentioned the Canadian Dry Eye Summit, which is coming up, and we're thrilled to have you again, David. And one of my passions really is carving out the education for the masses, and really kind of curating that. And so the Canadian Dry Eye Summit really is a focused meeting for doctors and actually for assistants. And we actually have a track called the Ocular Hygienist track to train assistants on assisting their docs with their procedures, performing things like, the various procedure-based therapies in office like LipiFlow and IPL and all those other sorts. And so we really put together that meeting. That's been something I've been working on for the last 5 years with our other partners, Dr. Trevor Miranda and Dr. Jeff Goodhue. So when I'm not doing that, I'm doing other consulting work, and I have a CSO position at a AI company. So I keep a little bit busy, but I also have a family, and I enjoy spending my time with them too.
Yeah. So let's talk about education a little bit. And, when I graduated optometry school, I did my residency, I started digging into the research. And one of the things that I always wanted to be was, an evidence-based optometrist. And, as you're leading off a meeting and so forth, it's difficult to necessarily with dry eye be evidence-based, because there's a lot of stuff that we're thinking about or conceptualizing that's maybe even ahead of the curve, right? I think of radio frequency as a good example. There's not that many studies on radio frequency, but it seems like some of the best dry eye doctors in the world, in the country, US and Canada, are doing radio frequency. IPL kind of stood in that before, the literature was out there. How do you kind of think about that as somebody who puts on a meeting, and how do we educate people around this?
That's such an important point. I think you hit the nail on the head in that, the pace at which we are gaining knowledge and the pace at which we are able to demonstrate that knowledge scientifically is becoming more and more disproportionate. The gap is widening. And so I think it's a balance, right? It's a balance between, like you brought up IPL, and I think it's a great example whereby, we start with the lowest basis of evidence, which is anecdotal, and we grow from there. Case reporting, eventually we do clinical trials, and eventually we get to an RCT. The challenge, of course, is that you can't always wait for that data to emerge before you make a decision, because as you and I have both discussed and chatted about, many of those of us on a podium or that are writing papers tend to also be the ones that want the new fancy toys the first and really are cutting edge. And so it does become a challenge between balancing those things out. I think, and I'm not certainly a fortune teller or have a crystal ball, but I do see the dry eye space as one of those particularly unique spaces where we will continue to have this problem of, the discrepancy between the evidence and the existing modalities of care. I think if we continue, though, to be critically aware of where the shortcomings are, and radio frequency, I think, is a perfect example because it is very popular right now, and it's also geographically popular, right? I think there's regions where there's not even one system, and then there's regions where there's 100. And so I think that is something that we always have to keep in balance, and keeping our eye on the critical appraisal, the scientific evidence base for it, but also attend a meeting, chat with a colleague. You and I are chatting here today, and we'll probably discover a few things that we hadn't seen or thought of. And I think that's really where we have to kind of guide ourselves.
Yeah. So I literally, while you were talking, just looked this up. And as of March 2022, I ran these numbers. I went and looked in the literature. Radio frequency has 6 articles published, intense pulse light 102, low light level therapy 17, and thermal pulsation 130. And some of those are now, there's tons of things coming out about them. And I think that you kind of nailed it on the head, where we start off with kind of the foundational and work our way up. And as you attend a meeting, you get to hear about what other people are doing. And I think that the beauty about the meetings, yours as a prime example, is you're bringing in people who are experts in these particular arenas that know what those therapies should be doing and can speak to the positives and maybe the shortcomings of them. And I think, more and more we're starting to struggle with this because of social media is being something where, do you give credit to this person who you like on social media, or do you give credit to this person who's speaking at an optometry conference who, has a credibility as being somebody who's done this sort of thing for a long period of time? And I think that's a challenge that we encounter today. Would you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's an important point, which is the distribution of education, right? We take it in through meetings, we take it in through readings, we take it in through writing, we take it in through conversations with our colleagues in the office. But we'd certainly be remiss to not mention that a lot of practitioners are taking it in through social media, and these are usually a few seconds clips or a few minute clips. And certainly this is not meant to be disparaging in that regard, but some of that information is popular because it's popular and not always grounded in science. Not always.
Yeah.
Sometimes it is. But when it's popular, boy, does it spread like wildfire. And it's kind of hard to put the rabbit back in the hat in a lot of those cases, right? So I think that's something that we always have to be cognizant of, is what are we surrounding ourselves with and ingesting, and how is that influencing our clinical habits, our recommendations, our modality of care, basically.
Yeah, and some of the people that are on the podium, that are speaking, that are writing, are also the ones that are publishing some of that stuff online, and we can look to them. And it kind of comes down to the level of the level of the content. Is, if I'm going to go out and do a lecture, most of the time I've had to submit an outline that somebody looks through and agrees that this is somewhat scientific. If I go out and do a writing, usually there's at least one, if not 2 or 3 people that have read it. And if you and I both know, if we write an article and something isn't cited, they say, hey, where's the citation for this? Where's the evidence and the proof? And with social media, we don't necessarily have that. So I think what you and I may agree to is that when we do see things that are new or somewhat innovative on social media, we probably need to go and look it up somewhere else and see where the evidence is coming from that.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's it. And I think if there's anything that, folks that are kind of ingesting education through these mediums, it is to double check, and to, we can have the utmost respect. I have the utmost respect to you, David. And if you said something to me, I'd be like, wow, you know what? That is interesting. And what I'm going to do after is I'm actually going to go and read up on it. Not because I doubt you, but because it's interesting.
No, but you should. I mean, we should always take it with a grain of salt, right? I mean,
That's right.
we
That's
could try
exactly
things,
right.
yeah.
So that
But it kind
critical
of also,
appraisal.
yeah, I think that's a key point is appraising and also making sure that it makes sense on the science side of things with what's happening to patients. Now, one of these topics that I think you and I probably might agree upon is I was asked by a company to do an assessment of 30,000 mybographies
Ooh,
and to grade 30,000 of them. I'm a little behind, but we've been grading these mybographies for this project that they're working on. And I look at my biography every day. I know you have for 10 years. And I'll be honest with you, there's a lot of story in the my biography story, right? There's a lot of
yeah.
things that we have as far as, hey, look at my biography. If it looks perfect and the patient's fine. Another story is, hey, what do you do if the my biography is gone? Does that mean the patient is doomed and we should bury it? You should dig a grave for them. How do you kind of interpret some of that stuff? And you see my biographies every day. Like, what's the story that you tell yourself in your head?
Yeah, no, I think, well, first of all, sorry that you got to go through 30,000 of those. If you're having trouble sleeping, I'm sure that may be the cure. But yeah, you raise a good point. I think that example of my biography is very valid. The examples of, a patient, for example, having very few visible glands on my biography. Well, we have to also consider, well, what are the limitations of that technology to begin with, right? We knew the earth was flat until it wasn't flat, right?
Right.
So we know something until we don't know it. And so the limitations of my biography, we use infrared lighting and deep red lighting that'll penetrate a certain depth, but the imaging quality is affected by edema in the tissue, papillary response, pigment in the tissue. All of these things create variability. We really need to make sure that we're not over promising or under promising in those cases what it means to the entire clinical picture. And so I've always said this, the morphology of the meibomian glands is important, but as is the function of those glands, right? So how do they express? You'd be surprised. And David, I'm sure you've seen this where you have glands
Yeah.
that appear to be absent and you squeeze, oil comes out. And where is that oil coming from? I mean, there's cross channels, there's periductal fibrosis. I mean, there's a ton of variables in there. So I don't like to hang my hat on any one finding. As you know, the surface of the eye, I mean, it's a system, right? And with every system, there's push and pull. There's an immunological basis, there's a neurosensory basis. And so, I can't look at my biography alone in exclusivity and hang my hat on it for that
Right.
reason. The second reason that I also kind of pull back a little bit is because our patients also hang their hat on that. And if you go to any dry eye forum, you're going to hear or read, sorry, a lot of patients saying, oh, I looked at my biography and my doctor said I had no glands left. And then that builds on the anxiety. And the
Yeah.
reality is, what does that actually mean? And do we
Yeah.
know what it means? And I'd say
Yeah.
that we don't yet know what that means.
No, we certainly don't. There's an interesting revelation, and I know you know this guy as well as I do, but Art Epstein was saying for quite a while that he could revive dead meibomian glands. And Art is a close friend of mine. And I'm like, Art, dead is dead, right? Unless the good Lord brings you back from the dead, you're dead. And lo and behold, I have to admit that maybe it wasn't dead. And we're starting to see, in some cases where we look at my biographies before and after treatment, and sometimes we see that, hey, it looks like that my biography might be getting a little bit better. And
Yeah.
you bring up the point about the imaging and maybe some limitations of the imaging that we have. And I don't think we're taking a grade 4 atrophy to a grade 0 atrophy, right? It's not necessarily getting completely better. And Luminesce has done some studies on showing the gland morphology improving,
Mhm.
after maybe a treatment, so or several treatments. So I think you're dead on that we've got a lot of things that we don't know. As my good friend Carolyn Blackie says, is we've got a lot of story
Yeah.
behind meibomian glands, and the science continues to prove that stuff for us. And that's what an example of maybe we're ahead of things and that rudder is driving us where we need to go and how we're thinking of. Are there other examples in your practice after having done this for this long where you're either appreciating a test or a treatment more the longer you do it, or you're devaluing something that you used to put a lot of credit into?
That's a really great question, David. You know, one of the things, again, technology is amazing and I always like to be on the cutting edge, but I have always found that conjunctival staining has been, and probably will always be one of my good friends. You know, staining that conj, particularly the superior conj, looking for an SLK pattern or just superior conj staining, has always been very revealing to me. And in some cases, it has guided the entire path of treatment, because that can tell you whether there is, you know, a frictional aspect to their inflammation, i.e. mechanical, whether there is goblet cell density loss. So I'm going to reach for a cyclosporine agent or a lifitegrast. But that's a sweet spot that I've always relied on. The second thing that, again, I didn't really lean on too heavily before was, you know, the disparity between signs and symptoms. As we talk more and more about neurosensory involvement in the dry eye cascade, right? So we have our neurotrophic and our neuropathic patients. I was always aware of that disproportion between signs and symptoms, but have become, and perhaps as my practice has matured and we've adapted more and more complex cases, we have the largest Sjogren's population in Canada just in our clinic alone, and that's to say something about the impact of the disease on the neurosensory component. So I really like to lean heavily on the validated symptom score and the clinical picture. And again, those are very low tech things that are available to everyone. As long as you have either a printer or a digital intake system, you get a symptom score, you look at that patient's eye, does it line up? And if it doesn't, why? Right? Our students love to answer that question. I think that's a question that we should always be asking. So
Yeah.
those are two really low tech, but I think incredibly useful diagnostic things that I lean on every day.
Yeah. So I've said this for years, and I'm a little bit an outcast in the arena of, I just think we should stop thinking about symptoms altogether, right? It's one of the least guiding
Mm.
components of true scientific dry eye, because the nerves of the cornea lie all the time. And so when symptoms become valuable is exactly what you said, when it's in a validated questionnaire, because then it becomes an objective measurement. It's an objective measurement that then we can be guided from time to time to always test back to.
Yeah.
Whereas if you say to the patient, how do you feel today? Whether their dog died or they won the lottery, their eyes feel different, right? But those
Yep.
objective measurements in those questionnaires are really helpful. And I'll speak to a diagnostic component that I used to give a lot of value to, but I really don't much anymore, and that is tear breakup time.
Mm.
And that's probably the number one thing that so many doctors rely on. And conjunctival staining, I mean, I knew that you and I were good friends because of that. I'm all over that with you. But tear breakup time, it doesn't tell me what to do.
Yeah.
It just tells me something's wrong, but it
Yeah.
doesn't tell me what to do. Now, the more I watch and observe tear breakup time, I might observe what type of dry eye it is, but just as a whole in a number, there's so many other things that would guide me in where I should go, right? If the meibomian glands are not secreting, I know that I need to do meibomian gland treatment. If there's conjunctival staining, or if there's inflammatory marker that's elevated, those things tell me how to go about my treatment. And tear breakup time just is not my favorite.
Yeah, I agree. I actually think that tear breakup time, I think, is a valuable tool to teach with for new students, to look at with a breakup pattern, to kind of understand if it's happening in different areas of the cornea, what it means. But I
Mm-hmm.
completely agree with you. After a while, it's great to teach and to kind of skill yourself up. But when you start to do this on a regular basis, it becomes less and less valuable as a metric
Yeah.
to direct therapy. 100%
Yeah.
agree.
So what's exciting? Over 10 years, you have something new and exciting every year that is jazzing you back into the world of dry eye. It's a new diagnostic, it's a new treatment, it's a new concept, it's a new theory. What is it right now that's driving you to want to be a better dry eye doctor?
To be honest, it's the innovation, really. It's the innovation and the interest from our colleagues, but the innovation, particularly in the neurosensory space. I
Mm,
think, to me, right now, I think that is the most important aspect. It's perhaps one of the most untapped components of our therapeutic opportunities. So, I think looking at the oxyrvate and nerve growth factor recombinants, biologics, and some of the new stuff, the tryptase receptors coming out. I know there's some clinical trials ongoing in the States right now. We're getting involved in some up here at the Prism. So that space right now is really, really exciting to me because I think it will, by its own nature, open up our interest. You and I both know that whenever a new product comes to market, it opens up a new opportunity to educate ourselves and our peers. And so in that, it's almost as if the market sometimes drives the interest. So right now, it doesn't seem like there's a huge amount of marketing behind it, but there's a lot of interest. That tells me that this is an area that's going to really explode.
mm,
And I'm super excited about that. I mean, at this point, our practice is fairly heavy in terms of using biologics and amniotic membranes and things like that. But I really do want to get more or see more targeted therapies in this arena. And I think that we're getting there. I think that we're going to get there.
yeah, yeah. Um, I think that once we get deeper into this neurosensory component, our good friend Laura Perriman,
Yeah.
she's just so smart, and when she starts talking about it, I'm like,
Oh, yeah.
yeah, she's just so smart, and I know she's going to be at the summit.
Yeah.
But the deeper we get into this, the more we really have to start digging back into the pathophysiology and really get to understand it. But I agree with you. I think this is a component, and as I've started to dig into it myself, neurotrophic keratitis. When we think about that, that's being end stage disease is where we typically think that. But I really think that the beginning of dry eye is
Neurotrophic.
we're on a slope, right? It's not that one day you become neurotrophic and then the day before you didn't. It is a glide towards that. And why is the ocular surface not producing the appropriate tear quality? Well,
Mhm.
it's because the neurosensory component is really breaking down with regards to that. Have you got a chance to get a 𝐊𝐚𝐫𝐝 anesthesiometer in your practice yet?
No, well, no, I had one on loan. We were doing a study. I had one on loan for a while, but no, I don't.
Yeah,
I rely on the old
the
cotton
cotton
wisp.
wisp.
But
I'm with you.
Jake Lang, I know he did a brief video on using hypertonic salt solution, if I recall correctly. And there was a paper that was published on this where you instill, I think it was a 5% NaCl solution that you instill, and you measure a response to the sting. It seems to be a little a little rough on our patients, but anyways, apparently that's another way to do it. Although I don't think I'm going
Uh-huh.
to be leaning on that too heavily.
Yeah. Well, if those of you who are listening don't know, a Cochet-Bonnet anesthesiometer, it looks like a big pen, and it's got a string, kind of like a fishing line that sticks out from it, and then you poke the patient in the eye with the fishing string at its fullest extent, and then if they don't feel it, you pull it back, and then there's a number that's calibrated so you can gauge what that is. And the instrument's like $500, and it has come in really handy when I
Mhm.
wanted to gauge the extent of the discomfort, right? I mean, I had a patient on oxyrvate, and she was at a 3, which means that it was pulled back the least sensitive, like where everybody else would be, you and me would be at a 6. She was
Mhm.
at a 3, we did oxervate, and then she was at a 5.5. And so I was able to gauge that and see that although she may not be all the way back to normal, I could gauge that number. And it was something I bought years ago because my resident wanted it, and I stuck it in the cupboard for 2 years, and then we pulled it out recently, and it's been a lot of fun. So I think you're dead spot on with neurosensory being a big component here. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, look, man, if you ever have a time to ship that up here to Canada, I'll give it a whirl.
Yeah. Well, dude, it has been great talking with you. Some really fun things that we highlighted here. I appreciate you spending some time on the OI show.
Hey, listen, thanks for having me. I really appreciate the conversation as well. We really do look forward to you coming to the Dry Eye Summit. Quick plug, I mean, I'll let everybody know if they want to go to dryeyesummit.ca for live tickets. The ocular hygienist program is actually sold out. We added a second day and it's sold out within, I don't know, 2 days. So, but we will probably have more digital content for your assistants if you want to get them trained up online. But we look forward to seeing you. I can't wait to get you up here in the Great White North. There could be some snow on the ground at that time. You never know.
Yeah. Yeah.
So dress warmly.
That's right. Awesome. Well, thank you for hanging out with us, and thank you for joining us for this episode of the OI Show. Make sure to like and subscribe, and stay tuned for future episodes for other amazing guests like the one we had today.